I got some stickers that I'm going to be putting all over town. I hope that's okay. Pretty cool, huh? Revolution stickers. Welcome, everybody, to Revolution. It is, oh my gosh, it's 9 o'clock at night on a Saturday. You're watching this on Sunday, but I'm going out of town. I'll be on an airplane as you're watching this. And I wanted to make sure this talk was out on time, especially with all the work I've been doing lately. But I've had some time off these past few days, and I've taken that time to go deep into really good commentary, the Yale Anchor commentary on Galatians, kind of refresh some things, look at some things. We've gone through Galatians 1, we've just hit part 2, Galatians 2. This is actually Galatians part 3 if you're watching right now. If you want to catch up, there's 2 videos ahead of this, or 2 podcasts if you're listening on our podcast. And thanks for that. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe. That always helps. All right, so here we are. We're in Galatians. Oh my gosh. I guess I should say real quick. Yes, it's a crazy time. I feel a bit overwhelmed. I mean, it seems like the country is upside down and people are kind of losing their stuff. And, I'm not used to presidential candidates talking about taking over other countries and things like that. And I mean, it's bizarre. It's really, what a bizarre time to be alive. And I'm a little bit bummed that the inauguration is on Martin Luther King Day. I mean, I understood it when Obama came into presidency. That would make sense, but this doesn't seem to make sense, and it kind of bothers me a little bit. But I think it's important for us to pay attention to what's happening and what's going on this time, and to allow this to be a time to remember Dr. King's words and remember what Dr. King talked about. And he talked about all the hard work we have to put in and what we have to do. And also remember, like, Dr. King wasn't always popular. Dr. King really did speak truth to power, and that often got him into quite a bit of trouble. And eventually, his life was taken. When his life was taken, he was one of the most unpopular people in America. And that's the thing that happens when we really fight for the equality of all people. When we really think all means all. When it's not just identity politics and things like that, when we really become truly inclusive and love people and love our enemies, and then when we love other people's enemies, we often become an enemy again. The past few years, I found it really hard to connect with other churches and other pastors and other ministries. I mean, it's just everybody seems very individually thinking and thoughts, and then everybody's divided. My real hope was that we would see more churches coming together and people working together and having better conversations and difficult conversations. Unfortunately, it seems like everybody keeps wanting to be lone rangers. And I get that, because I was that way for a long time, until really the emergent church kind of pulled me in, and I started working with them a bit, and I miss that community. I don't know if you saw a video. I put up a video. One of my friends was canceled from a speaking engagement because of rumors that were on about him 15 years ago on the internet. And I know they weren't true. I know the whole story. I know the whole family. And it was just one of those things where it was like this really big mainline denomination that did it. And it was just really it broke my heart, because I feel like we constantly, like, and it's one of these denominations that's like very inclusive now, and so it's like, oh, we're inclusive, and we have the gay flag, and we welcome all, and almost sometimes I worry about this. Well, everybody's welcome. It's just like the signs on the old evangelical churches when it said everybody welcome. It's like, well, not really. Even now the main lines are like everybody's welcome, but it's like not really. If you're canceling people and canceling over rumors and stuff you read on the internet, and not even going to the person or going into the person's friends and seeing if it's true. It's just, what have we become? What have we become? We really do, like in the beginning of Galatians 1, over the past 2 weeks we went through, we talked about, you serve another gospel. You've turned away from grace so soon. And it seems that we all do that, and it feels like we get stuck in that turning away from grace, no matter what leaning you are, conservative or liberal, or or whatever, it just seems like we all somehow want this control thing to happen. And sometimes I think it's almost more of a capitalist idea than it is a spiritual idea or a faith idea. It's this idea that, well, we've got to have our community, we've got to have our rules and and if we have this community, then we have people who aren't in this community. And so my friend was made clear, like, well, you were part of this community, but then we heard this stuff on the internet, so now you're not part of the community. It's like we're always keeping people out and not giving the people the benefit of the doubt, or even saying like, hey, did this happen 15 years ago? If it did, what have you done to kind of make it better? Nothing. There's like, we talk about grace and restoration, but we don't practice it. And to me, that speaks really loudly of why the church is disappearing, why we're not going anywhere. And the church really does need to freaking do better. With Dr. King Day coming up, Reverend Martin Luther King Day coming up, and I think about when he was assassinated and he was at his most unpopular, because he spoke truth and he spoke about that all-inclusiveness. And when we do that, we almost have to break out of community. We have to break out and go be with the strangers and be with people we don't always agree with. When we really decide to fight for equality through diversity, is like John Hume, the Irish politician, used to speak about, is when we really fight for, that means everybody. That means everybody has to we have to sit at a table where we have people who disagree with us. People who might not accept us because of their spiritual or their Christian belief systems and things like that. Because if living in a country like America, that's kind of part of it, is that there's going to be that, and is it for everybody or is it not? And so that's a real hard thing for people to struggle with. And I think that's one of the reasons why Dr. King became so unpopular, is because he kept just reaching out. He just kept opening more and more. I mean, it's like civil rights, and then he anti-war, and then poor people, and then and it just more inclusive. And I think you see something similar with Jesus, and I think we will see that today in Galatians 2, as what we're seeing with Paul and with the gospel is, and that something brand new was happening with Paul, and as he met with the apostles, is that Christianity was taking the next step. It was taking another step to inclusion, and we often don't realize that. So today, I think I'm excited about. So let's just jump into it. Last week, I thought we were still in 1, but we're not. Last week we had talked about. We ended up at the part in Galatians 2 where the Apostle Paul is talking about how they went to Jerusalem. I'm sorry, they went to Jerusalem and met with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, which is Peter and John and James. And they were considered the 3 pillars of the Jerusalem church, the big leaders, And when they were there, how they were spied upon to spy on their freedom to see if they were circumcised or not. And Paul kind of gets into that. So we're going to look at that. We're going to go over that again. And we're going to jump on down and hopefully get into the story of Peter. So let's just kind of, I'm going to start at 7. So we're going to get past the false brothers and all that stuff and the spying on, because we talked about that last week. But it is interesting how often, like, you think about there are people spying on their freedom, and how often, like, when Christians sit down together from different denominations or different groups, and you kind of feel each other out, And I remember there was this Christian tattoo artist years ago, and I would go over, and this was in Georgia, and sometimes I'd go over there, and I never felt like I was good enough. Here I was pastoring a church, and he was like just so like, no, and I just always felt like I was not good enough, and it was like you sometimes have those people who feel like they're looking for faults. They're looking for reasons to judge you. And that's what Paul is talking about with some of these folks in Jerusalem. I also think what Paul's doing with these folks in Jerusalem is he's pointing out kind of what's happening in Galatia with the Galatians, with the Gauls, and with the Jewish Christians and the uncircumcised and the uncircumcised Christians. What's happening with these guys? And I think he's saying, like, all right, this is kind of his tipping into it, into it, if you will. No pun intended. Oh, please don't forget to like and subscribe. My son always tells me, make sure they like and subscribe, Dad. He wants me to be the Mr. Beast of churches, but I fingers crossed. If we ever get that big, we'll give money away like that, but we won't make you like play games. All right, so let's just start at Galatians 2:7. Well, yeah, okay, 6. And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. I think that's very important too. Is that God shows no partiality. He's saying this about these leaders in Jerusalem, the biggest church at the time. I mean, well, maybe not. I think Antioch was bigger, which Paul started, but Jerusalem's like, you got the pillars there. You got the guys who hung out with Jesus there, and he's kind of saying like, there's not favorites. God doesn't play that game. And it's honestly strange to me how, like, there's even like whole theologies that are based that God loves these people and not these people, or loves these people and these people but not quite these people, or that he made these people for, that's, and often it's the Apostle Paul they used to do that. Anyhow, those leaders who contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. And he goes on to say, for he was worked through Peter, making him the apostle to the circumcised, and also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. So when he says this, it's really a powerful moment, and it's a moment that I don't think we realize how big of a moment this is, how big of a moment this really is in the book of Galatians. Because he's sitting down with three of the disciples, who are the pillars of the church, and this is probably before Antioch and before Galatians and all this stuff. And he's saying, I am here to tell you that I am called to Gentiles. Before this, Christianity was seen as kind of a type of Judaism, a sect of Judaism. And you may know that Gentiles weren't welcome. Now, Jesus reached out to a couple Gentiles, but he also was like, the Gentile woman was like, well, don't even, had to say to Jesus, well, don't even dogs get crumbs from the table? And then he's like, your faith made you whole. It was almost like Jesus has this moment of, where almost as Jesus repents or has seen something, everybody's like, well, he was just setting her up to test her faith. But I don't know. I wasn't there. But it's one of those moments where you go, oh, so the Gentile thing was not happening. It wasn't this big Gentile movement. And all of a sudden Paul goes, I want to reach Gentiles. Now, of course, they were like, okay, well, only you can reach Gentiles. No Jewish Christians. So basically they open up this whole new world to Paul. And this is a new thing that's happening. This is a radical thing. This is more inclusion is happening with the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul is going like, we should be open to everybody, because Gentiles is everybody else. And Christianity, he's saying we've got to open, Christianity is for everyone, all human beings, all men, all. That's why when Paul says, literally when he says later, and we'll go over that, is there's neither Jew nor Gentile, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, he gets rid of all the identities, is because he's saying it's everybody. We're all one in Christ. And it's easy to see that and think, well, that only counts for Christians, right? And it's like, no, it counts for everybody, because Christ sees us all as one. And that's a really radical moment in Christianity, and one that I don't think we talk about enough. I don't think we ever look at. I don't ever hear people talking about. I don't see people writing about it. As this moment, is like almost as powerful as the moment of the resurrection, and Jesus starts saying, "Love." And then now it's saying like this resurrection isn't just for the Jews, it's for everybody. It's for all human beings across this big round planet, this big flat planet. And he's getting the okay from, even James, who is really kind of more of a law, practicing, very Jewish Christian. And so we have this really radical moment of extreme inclusion that's happening right here that I think we just all need to sit with for a second. So everybody just and allow that moment to hit you. Allow that moment to go like, oh, holy, wow, this is inclusion. Now, how wild is it that it's so many people don't like the Apostle Paul in the church. A lot of people, liberal people, like, oh, I don't really like Paul. Oh, I just kind of skip over Paul. Oh, Paul's kind of a bastard. Well, I understand, because some of the letters that are not written by Paul are kind of crazy. And I know a lot of people get hung up on Romans 1, but they've also got to read Romans 2. And Paul is a human being, and he is a product of his time. But if you take Paul within his time, you go realize that he was quite radical for someone in 2,000 years ago in Middle Eastern culture following a religion. Quite radical. And ironic, Paul is like this first Christian to start this diverse community who's given the thumbs up to go like, all right, go out there. Gentiles and Galatians, these were folks, these were Gauls, these were kind of like European looking more people. They battled, they were warrior people. When they went to war, they went to war naked. Like if you look back at times of Gauls and Galatians people, the statues, they're like swords and then just nothing else, just a sword and a what do you call it? The shields, shields and swords, and just all their business is out there, So for people like me who would be like, put something on for the love of God. I'm not even comfortable at the gym, so I would have been like, you guys win, take it over. Just put some pants on now. But that was the thing. And so Paul's going like, I'm going to reach out to all these people who are part of different traditions, people are part of religions, people who don't know anything about our religion, have no tradition, have no background, and I'm going to love and reach out to everybody. And so we don't often focus on the fact that Paul is like this pioneer of taking Christianity to a next level. It's like the moment when Jesus goes through Samaria and talks to the Samaritan woman. These are big moments in this idea of faith and who God is, and is God only a God of these people, and I am the Son of God. God only with these people, No, God is everybody. There's everybody. Jesus loves everybody. Don't remind me. As the what is that? There's a band that has a song like that in it. So ironically, we have Paul as this first Christian that starts this diverse community of church, and then you've got all these people who are going like, And then you have others who misuse Paul to do the very exact opposite, is to say, no, we don't want gays, we don't want these people, no, the God only chose, Jesus only loves these people and not these people, and uses Paul for those same reasons. That's why it's important to study the Bible. It's also why I would say we should never be teaching the Bible in schools unless you are hiring biblical scholars to teach children, and you're also having scholars from every other faith teaching their religious stuff. I just don't think that's a good thing. So you've got this really interesting thing. And I just want to ask a lot of you, have you given up on Paul? And do you think I've given up, I don't know. And I have a lot of friends who are passionate, who are like, I don't know, Paul, man. Oh, why are you telling me about Paul? Why are you trying to make Paul better? And, have we given up on Paul? And then my question is, do you think Paul would have given up on us so easily? And I think the book of Galatians shows that his teaching and his passion for humanity and people shows that it's not. He would not. There's a great part in this book where how Paul sees God, and they just use those things that Paul refers to about God, and it's very interesting. This is the could you imagine writing like a 3-page letter and then having somebody write this much about your 3-page letter? This is how he explains how Paul now identifies God by these principles. He goes, and it's from different verses in Galatians, but these are some explanations he gives. The one who called you, the one who singled me out, the one who called me, the one who was at work, the one who supplies the Spirit, the one who works miracles, the one who called you. Called you, he called me. He works miracles. Supplies us with the Holy Spirit. Who is at work? And you see a new work happening here, right there in Galatians. Right here we see this meeting. And I just think it's very easy to read past that. I think I have almost all the times I've gone through it and not realize that. And it's this time that just kind of woke me up. And I was like, oh, yes, this is great. We'll go on. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and the circumcised, so the Gentiles and go to everybody. They asked only we think about the remember the poor, which is actually what I was eager to do. Now, this is something that I found out that's new, which is going to kind of blow everybody's mind. And I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. You can see how you can test this out, but this comes from reading this commentary. And these commentaries are known, like there's one on every book in the Bible. I think of pretty much. I mean, I've always seen one on every book I've been reading, but this is known as probably one of the best, most exhausted commentaries on New Testament writings, and I think there's some Old Testament ones too. But where did I go? James and recognize you as a grace, but that had been given to me. They gave Barnabas and me the right hand. Oh, and help the poor. And so in this commentary, it talks about the poor, and they add up all these different verses. And what Paul's talking about is not just the poor in this one. Now, Jesus said, take care of the poor, and of course, that's what we want to do and what we try to do. I mean, and heck, most of us are poor. But he says that this was a very particular reference to the Church of Jerusalem, because the Church of Jerusalem with the three pillars were struggling to continue. And Paul, was starting this new thing, and he did. He started a community in Antioch, and it became the biggest, most diverse community in the church, in a big metropolitan city of the time, and became so. Often, when Paul talks about, he's on his way to Antioch, he's bringing finances that he has helped raise to help support their church as well. They all work together as a community. Imagine that. They all work together. Not everybody was on their own mission. It's tough. It's tough, That's why I don't feel like that's why I feel like Revolution's still a gathering. I wanted to, want to call it a church, but it's just I don't feel like, it's us. But I feel like other communities are really struggle to get in. I'm really grateful for the MCC church here, and here in Green Lake in the university area, and Pastor Brian and all them for really, really welcoming me and this vision, because I've been really grateful for that. But it's been really tough to kind of connect with other people in this similar work. So that's because the only one thing is that we remembered, and he goes, yes, and actually I was eager to do that. So that's he's talking about the Church of Jerusalem, and I just thought that was interesting because it's not something we often think about as this, hey, we all have to survive, great, go do that, but don't forget to, we got to help each other out. We've got to do this work and continue to do this work, and it's not free, to do this. Interesting there. Anyway, but when Cephas came to Antioch, and that was the community that Paul was starting, which was a very diverse community of Christians, of Jews and Gentiles and all mixed. I had to oppose him to his face because he stood self-condemned. So this is interesting. This is a very cool story about Paul rebuking Peter. And I always saw this was as Paul kind of showing like, hey, listen, if I rebuke Peter, you should listen to me because Peter's one of the pillars of the church. That means I'm one of the pillars of the church. If I'm rebuking a pillar, we're all big deals, But there's other way to look at this in this letter is that this is his way of talking to his critics, because he knows his critics will be reading this letter as well. There's many copies passed out around the city. And so this is his way of kind of his rebuke to this happens. I tell you a story. His rebuke to Peter is also his way of saying these things to his enemies. This is, maybe he's Minnesota nice, a little passive aggressive. But this is his way of seeing what's happening in Galatia, that this isn't the first time he's seen this problem before, that he's even seen Peter. And I think in a way it's really interesting because to say, like, I even saw Peter had to be rebuked and that Peter stood self-condemned. In a way, he's saying to his enemies, like, hey, you guys are confused and you're confusing people, but it's okay. You're not in the worst company. Peter did the same thing. This is a confusion that we're dealing with right now as we reach out and become more inclusive. This is something that we're dealing with, and that's why it's important to have these conversations. That's why it's important for me to write hard letters that are difficult conversations. It's important for us to have this because we're becoming more inclusive, and some people don't share that vision. And even people who do share the vision sometimes take, progress, not perfection, take, 2 steps forward and then 8 steps back. And you know what I mean? Doing the cha-cha of growing, it takes time. And so we see here, it goes, but I had to oppose him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For in turn, until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. So there's that James again. James is kind of, Jewish Christian guy, kind of, and I think that's why he also brings James up a lot, of saying, hey, James said, hey, we're happy for you to do this. But you see this moment where some of James's folks show up to Antioch. I don't know, probably not saying it right, but Antioch. Until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. So he got afraid of the traditionalists. He got afraid of the people. In a way, it could be like if you look about like LGBT affirming and things like that. And when I was doing that in 2005, and I would go to these meetings and meet with all these different people and try to help them. I would remember going to the Red Letter Christian thing a lot and really getting into a lot of really hard conversations about saying, hey, you guys got it. This is a civil rights issue, and you're civil rights leaders. Let's jump on this. And it was tough conversation. And, sometimes after a conversation, you'd watch everybody break for lunch or dinner on these tables. And they're like, oh, do you have to be affirming to be here? Oh, do you have, and everybody would start talking. And honestly, it's like you can see these little moments, these little Galatian moments, these little Antioch moments happen in real time. I mean, this was 2005, 2006, 2007, but you could see it happen in real time. All the little factions start, And so he's saying that, and he goes, and the other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So he's going like, all right, guys, even Barnabas, who works with me, who knows our mission, who was there when we got the mission, when we sold the mission, when we got the right hand of fellowship, and they were all fell back. They all got worried. I mean, James must have been quite a nerve-wracking guy to be around for this to happen. He must have had a lot of pull, and there must have been a lot of struggles for him as well as Gentiles were coming in, because these folks weren't going to get circumcised. They weren't going to obey certain holidays and other days and do all these things, For them, Christianity was really about love and grace and non-violence. I mean, for the first, first 200 years or 400 years? I have to look that up again. The brain's a little bit tired because it's 9:30 at night. But, Christianity was completely non-violent. Christians didn't go to war. They didn't fight. And then they were completely peaceful. It wasn't until Constantine comes along and then starts to be like, oh, Jesus wants us to win people with swords rather than love. But anyway, you've got this, and he separates even Barnabas, his friend, in the streets. So I think this is in one way a very graceful way of confronting your enemies, going like, hey, listen, you guys are causing this mess. Some of you are falling into this mess. But you guys know Barnabas, and he even fell into it. You know Peter, he fell into it. But the fact is, I still had to say something. There still had to be something said. And I used to see this in a lot less of a graceful way than I've seen it this time as I've gone through Galatians. And I've gone through Galatians probably 100 times. But you start to go like, oh, there's a little bit of like, almost like saying like, this happens to the best of us. But even when it does happen to the best of us, we must stand up. We must speak truth. We must speak justice. We must speak equality. We must speak inclusion. No matter who falls for this. And I think maybe that's why he prepared us. Even if an angels preach another good news, may they be accursed. So Paul's making it very clear, like, this is the message. The message has grown. The message has become more inclusive. It seems like a new message, and it's here, and a lot of people are struggling to adjust to it. Now, here we are 2,000 years later, and I still see people struggling to adjust to this inclusive idea. even some of the people who seem to say they're the most inclusive churches in the world. I mean, even Universal Unitarians and mainliners who are, have every flag for every group of people you've ever seen, and they still struggle with inclusion. We all, because it's like, oh, well, now these people are, it's like, this is not, we don't, sorry, makes me a little crazy how we're just constantly looking for people to scapegoat or leave out or exclude. And then we don't realize is that when we do that, we aren't able to have conversations like Paul is having with Peter right now. There's not even those moments, especially when we go, oh, we just don't want you. Oh, we've heard some things, we just don't want you. That's what the church does now, It has been doing for years and years and years. I mean, they did that. I mean, I used to see that so much as a child in the evangelical church. I just thought I guess I was naive because I didn't grow up in those other denominations. So I always thought, the Lutherans must have it all. They got the grace and the stuff. Oh, especially the ELCA Lutherans. They really got the grace. They're like really, they must have it all together, And it's kind of like that grass is greener on the other side. And we're all just haphazardly human and all human. So he stood self-condemned, for he used to eat with the Gentiles, but kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction, for that group of believers. And the other, that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel. How interesting is that? When they were not acting consistency with the truth of the gospel. So what's the truth of the gospel? Is that everybody deserves a seat at the table, even when it's uncomfortable. We should be eating together. We should be having conversation. The truth of the gospel is that we don't split up into factions. We don't act as though we're better than others. We don't, that's not our role, to play politics, to play religious politics with each other. He's saying we don't do that. When you separate yourself from these folks and go, I don't want to be seen with that type of religious person or that type of religion or that type of non-religion or that type of, identity. Paul's making it very clear that that's no longer the gospel. That's your own human nature and your own insecurities and your own self coming into that, or the own pressures of tradition. What rumors spread by dead people, tradition is. You've got all these things coming on you, and that's not the gospel. That's not the good news. That's not what Jesus died for. That's not what Paul eventually was killed for. That's not what Martin Luther King, as we celebrate him on Monday, that was not his. That's not why these guys died, because they stood up and just when they saw that the gospel was not being practiced, when they saw that they were not, when people were not being consistent with the truth of the gospel, they were clearly saying, this is the truth of the gospel. I said to Cephas, which is Peter, before them all, if you, though a Jew, like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So at the same time, Paul is talking to his people who are reading this letter, who are falling into the same thing and falling into the same trap, and to these leaders who are preaching this. So he's saying this to Paul, but he's also telling it for these people. He's saying it to the people, the reader. Once again, I'll read that again. I said to Peter, before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you be compelled, the Gentiles, to live like the Jews? How can you be a hypocrite? How can you do this to others? And so Paul makes it very clear that how can you put impossible standards on other people? I mean, he knows, he was a Pharisee. He understood when you loaded people up with like really tough things to do and things, and he's going, how can you do that? That's hypocrisy. And I used to think that the reason we don't get the end of this story was because it probably turned out poorly. But I was thinking maybe the reason we don't get the end of the story is because he's saying this for the people who are causing trouble in Galatians, to the Galatians in Gaul. He's speaking to them, and it's like this is what's happening. And I think that he's saying, this is it. This is what I'm saying to you. You know, how can you turn so quickly from a good news? How can you, Jews who live like Gentiles, expect Gentiles to live like Jews? How can you practice this? And this is not, again, this is not the truth of the gospel. And I think those are very powerful words when Paul says that in Galatians 2:14. You're not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, which is we are all one. Neither Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, none of us. We're all one, male or female. There's no hierarchy. There's no lowarchy, no molarchy. We're here, we're all here. He goes on to explain that we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Christ. And we have come to believe in Christ Jesus so that we might be justified by faith, Christ, not by doing the works of the law, because no one will be justified by the works of the law, But if in our efforts, and this is what he's saying Paul's doing this, and he's saying this, he sent Peter to this is what's happening to Peter, this is what's happening to Barnabas, this is what's happening to the troublemakers in Galatia. He goes, but if in our effort to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have been found to be sinners, is Christ to be the servant of sin? Certainly not. What he's saying is like when we go back to the law, when we go back to these regulations, it often becomes a very hypocritical thing. And we find ourselves unjust to the law and all this, and it's no longer about grace. And so this is something that we see so many people fall into day after day after day. So I want to make a few comments on this. One is it's this hard to say, it's often like this shallow understanding. As I was saying before, like often like you see people who say like, you see Paul struggling for the inclusion for this group. He's struggling for this church to be unified through Jewish Christians or circumcised, uncircumcised Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians come together. He's using this point of that he's been here before, he's done this before, he's had to have these conversations before. And this is so vitally important that it's just strange to me that I see so many people in this work, one, not practice these principles, which really makes me, it's probably why I continue to do the work. I think if these principles were practiced all the time, maybe I would just start painting and doing all that stuff full time and just be like, I'll come home and watch Netflix and eat and take care of my kids and not worry about this. But that's not what's happening, and it's got to happen now. We've got to allow this type of inclusion to be real, and we've got to share it with people. And the problem is we don't, it's this like misunderstanding. So I've got all these, really inclusive brothers and sisters who are saying, well, I don't really like the Apostle Paul because of this, this, and that. And I'm like, well, you need to look at the biblical scholarship. You need to know what Paul wrote and what Paul didn't, and they don't. And then you see these conservatives who do use Paul to be as a weapon, as like this hammer and the fist, and they don't get it either. And it reminded me, this is often the understanding and the confusion of the Apostle Paul in Christianity. And what it reminded me is of Dr. King's quote. Dr. King had a wonderful quote that said, "Shallow understanding from people of good will is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding of people of ill will." Do you hear me again? Shallow understanding, Dr. King said, shallow understanding from people of good will is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. So when I was talking to my friend and he said, I got canceled from another church, I was like, oh man, what happened? And he's like, it's that old stuff. And I was like, are you kidding? Like, Brian McLaren and all these other people came out and spoke on your behalf, and the people who were condemning my friend had no history with this person or this family, it's just so much, I don't know, it's hurt people, hurting people. And gossip, unfortunately, doesn't ever get put back in the bottle. That's what you got to remember when you're gossiping about people, when you're tearing people down on the internet. You know, you don't know what you're doing to their life or their livelihood or their children or their family. And if it's mistruth, you know, it's like it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle, you know. For example, I've got this, my kids have this, when they were little, we got them this lava. It's a lava, it's got pictures of lava on it, and it's a lava lamp. And the bulb burned out. And so I had to find a new bulb for it and all this stuff. And ever since we got the new bulb, it's, you know, the thing starts boiling up at the top. It gets really weird. It gets too hot. You know, that never quite does like the cool lava that it used to. I mean, it's fuzzed out right now because I'm on the film setting, so it looks a little cooler, but it never quite does what it's supposed to. And this has only been on for like an hour. You know, after about an hour and a half, everything's up at the top. And it's like that, you know, it's like, well, you know, the first thing, it was really great. And now, you know, no matter what I do to it, it just can't ever be quite right again. And that's what happens with gossip. It just destroys people's lives. And that's what happens with legalism as well, as we see that happening here. But as you see, when Dr. King says shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will, because a lot of good people would say, well, you're just going to wait. You know, the African American culture, you can just wait, you know. And he's like, you don't know what you're talking about, you know. And this kind of shallow understanding of the Apostle Paul for me is very frustrating. So I was really frustrated when my friends said, well, I don't have this. And I'm like, you know, I almost got into my car and drove to this place because it was in Seattle. I almost got my car and drove, you know. And I told a friend, who's like, oh, they probably would have been mad. And I'm like, but it's not even about my friend. This is a bigger thing. This is about all people. This is about this not happening over and over again to human beings who are being hurt and canceled and treated like, you know, less than and judged and shown no grace, no mercy, no forgiveness. You know, to me, this is a travesty. It's not just about that person. It's about, you know, when our family, when our kids grow up and my kids' kids grow up, you know, I mean, this is something that needs to be stopped. We need to wake up. We need to be, you know, I want to go in and say, well, when I saw that we're not actually being consistently with the truth of the gospel. I saw you're not being consistent with the truth of the gospel by what you did. And we often do this with Paul with a shallow understanding and think, well, we can just skip over. There's nothing to learn from this guy, blah, blah, blah. Even though a lot of people say, well, if it wasn't for the Apostle Paul, Christianity may have died an earlier death, you know, or just been seen as this type of, you know, just a spin-off of Judaism that faded away. I'm not saying Paul's special, because Paul would be the first one not to say he was special. He probably would have said, oh, somebody else would have come along, you know. Somebody else would have got called. But it's that shallow understanding that also often frustrates me, but it also often turns into those things of like, well, we're going to not have these people. We're not going to work together. We're not going to sit at the same table. You know, it's so frustrating, because much less I can't get Christians who think things differently to sit at the same table. Then you think about trying to get people who have different political beliefs sitting at the same table. And then you think about, well, trying to get a conservative Christian with, you know, someone who's more of a liberal, openly gay affirming or LGBTQ member of the church to say, hey, we're all going to sit right at the table together. It's really tough, you know, and I understand why it's tough, you know. But I will say I think the truth of the gospel is tough. I think that's what it means when it says take up your cross, you know. I think that's what it means when it's die to our flesh. I think that's what it means when it says love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, endures through every circumstance. I think that's what Jesus meant when he looked at his disciples and said, they will know you belong to me by your love for one another. You know, that's the truth of the gospel. It embraces the contradiction. No one's out. It's not about being popular, you know, or winning, you know, it's about being willing to speak truth to power, but also saying, and that grace is for you, which you see in this book at the end. Paul starts to talk about the very, very important message of restoration. And obviously Paul didn't excommunicate and start a new religion. He didn't go off and go, well, I'll just start the Paul gospel. I'll just start the Paul Christianity, you know. Because he would get angry when people would say, well, I follow Paul. He would say, no. This is not it. This is Christianity. We're not followers of people. He said, I'm glad I didn't baptize you guys, because you guys are all saying you're followers of people who baptize you. That's not how this works. And I often feel like there's such a shallow understanding from people who, call themselves ministers and pastors and things like that, because they say, well, I'm going to skip over that. I'm not going to look at that. I'm not going to see what Paul has to say. And Paul, I think if we want to really truly practice Christianity and understand grace, is vital. I don't feel like I really understood who Christ was and the importance of Christ's and God in my life until I read the Apostle Paul. And then I was able to go back and see Jesus in a different light. Of course, I was seeing Jesus through the lenses of all these other people had given me. But when I did my own study, and it became good news, it really did. The truth of the gospel became this really beautiful, inclusive thing, and it continues to be. And it continues to alienate more people. When it's really, to me, it's not about alien, it's bringing people together. And so with the 12 of us or the 10 of us or how many of us are on here right now, and then the folks who listen later on the podcast and such, we're all together going like, okay, we are going to practice this as human beings. As the Revolution gathering, we gather once a week, but we're out here gathering with other people, and we're going to practice the truth of the gospel. We're going to try to be as consistent with the truth of the gospel as we can. Of course, we'll remember that it's progress, not perfection, and that we've got to make sure to put on our air mask first before we can put on the other people's air masks. I understand that. It's not some like, you got to be perfect, you got to do this, and if you don't, you're out. But it's the fact that too, that, hey, maybe be open to if someone's, I remember one time years ago in New York, I had somebody come up to me and say, hey, you're full of shit. And I went, what? And they sat, and then I said, well, can we talk about this? And they said, yes. And they sat down and talked. And I realized I had been excluding them because they were, gosh, this is after I just became a Freeman, and I think they were polyamorous, and I just wasn't familiar with what was going on. I wasn't, all they wanted to do was help pack envelopes and send out merchandise. And they called me out on it. And it wasn't even anything I was thinking about. It was just kind of almost unconsciously like, yeah, sure, yeah, we'll see, And I go, yep. It felt like he went, because I was like, but then it was like, but you were right. You were right. I was being a hypocrite. I was excluding you. I wasn't, you wanted to help. You wanted to literally just pack envelopes. Unfortunately, that's how most of the church is. And some of you probably are shocked by what you let them pack envelopes, oh, mercy. It's amazing how grace shows up to you at times, and how the people who teach you lessons. So that's kind of where we're at with Galatians 2, and we'll hit that a little bit more at the end of that, because we didn't finish it up today. We'll hit some of that a little bit more, because I feel like there's some details that I really wanted added, but for time's sake I won't. But one of the things I really want to say to you folks out there today is, please let it be known that Revolution and myself are here to clear up these confusions, to try to clearly live the gospel of inclusion, to try to help misunderstandings that people may have. This is the work. The work is to say, hey, there was a new message. Something happened when the Apostle Paul sat down with with the pillars, with James and John, and Peter, when they all sat down together, and they go, gosh, this is bigger than we even knew. It just gets bigger and bigger. God keeps doing things. It seems like God's doing new things, and we thought God doesn't change God's mind, or God doesn't do this, because all these rules that we have on God now, which is really bizarre. I think once we figure out God, or we have rules for God, God may cease to be God. Just a thought. But Revolution is here to say, we're here to try to be consistent with that gospel message, and we won't always be. I won't always be. I'm a human being, but Revolution as a community, as a gathering, that's what we're here to do. And please share that with your friends. It's like, we're trying our best to clear this up. This is why we talk about having hard conversations. This is why we talk about talking to people that we disagree with. That true inclusion, not just diversity of skin tone and identity, but or sexuality or things like that, but diversity of thoughts and diversities of politics and diversity of ideas is coming together as a community. And it's going to get harder. I think it's going to get really tough. But I think Revolution's here for a time as that. And I think that's what the book of Galatians is here to remind us all, is that this is what we're here for. I mean, this book is to say, hey guys, you know, maybe you need to speak truth out of compassion, out of grace, to the folks that you think like Christian nationalists, for example. Maybe you need to be able to go say, hey, how can you say this when you live this way and you expect these people to do this? You know, I mean, we are able to have these conversations. Paul is showing us that we can have these conversations and still be loving and still be graceful and not have to cancel anybody. You know, he doesn't go, then I never spoke to Peter or James again. You know, it doesn't happen. I mean, we see some little more conflict in other books of the Bible with these guys. But I think that's what we're called to do. And this complete shallow understanding that we continue to have in the church and don't see these type of thoughts and these ideas is just boggling to my mind, and that we continue to separate one another and we continue to divide each other up. You know, the Bible talks about what beautiful fruit bring the good news. So if that gospel is Paul saying, I got to remind you, Paul, I got to remind you, Peter, you know, you're not living the gospel. You know, this is the opposite. It's exclusion. It's not inclusion. I mean, and if that's the gospel, you know, and if we're going to live that, we got to show it, you know. And so you look at this, you know, the point that Paul is making with the story of Peter and Antioch is that, you know, for the Galatians. Anyway, we all fall short. But we've got to continue to talk about these type of ideas. And for me, you know, the book of Galatians is a continued inspiration, as is MLK. And I hope you'll dive into MLK on Monday and listen to some of his talks, maybe purchase one of his books and things like that. He's way better than even his quotes, you know. It's like when I first heard The Doors, I just heard the best of, and then I bought all the albums, and I was like, well, the best of really isn't the best of, you know. His quotes are fantastic, but man, he says some really radical stuff about inclusion and loving others and loving your enemies and not letting people become your enemies, but seeing, you know, misinformation as your enemies. It's challenging stuff. And to me, that's the same thing that Paul's saying here. You know, it's just, it seems to be the natural evolution of faith with Christ in it. The Christianity is this natural evolution of inclusion, you know, but I've seen it often become exclusion. You know, I've seen people come into Revolution and be so excited to hear the message and then just move into I've got one friend who I worked with for years, you know, and now he won't even talk to one of his kids anymore because he doesn't agree with their sexuality, you know, and it just breaks my heart, you know, because it's like, man, I tried to say like these stuff you're dabbling in is dangerous and it's not the gospel. I mean, I know they're Christians, but they're not really, you know, and it just turns out people are able to still just turn away from grace and jump into legalism very easily. If Peter, who hung, I think of like all these guys who were like walking with Jesus every day and saw all this stuff can do that, we're all capable. By the grace of God goes I. You know, that one of the things when we would see people in my 12-step program fall off the wagon, if you will, and you go, by the grace of God go I. You know, that could be me easily. And when we see people slip into legalism, we see people slip into judgmentalism, by the grace of God go on. I don't see as many people do this proactively as I have seen Zoe. They really do this. Zoe seems to find all the different pastors that they have worked with in the past or that they meet online, and they really make a huge effort in community. And they are really good at it. Myself, I'm trying it, but I seem to keep getting doors shut in my face, and maybe it's because I'm a little bit too passionate, and I'm maybe meant more for this realm than that. But I do have great conversations and great disagreements with people. It's just not, you know, church people, and maybe church isn't where I need to be, you know. But anyhow, we will continue to talk about the good news and what the gospel is, and that type of inclusion. I hope you felt like as pumped as I did today about this stuff, because to me it's just like, oh, something radical happened. And I've read Galatians all these times, and I just didn't realize how radical it was in such a huge moment of inclusion. Like, share this with your friends, you know, share this with your people, share this with folks you know, and say, oh, you know, Paul, you know, you've given Paul kind of a tough, you know, did you ever realize this moment, what was happening at this moment? It was complete inclusion. It wasn't like and you need to change and act just like us. It's like, no, you need to have your own faith, because what we're, and we're actually trying to, we are going to still practice the things we want. We'll still maybe get circumcised because as that's part of our tradition, but we're not going to force you to live in and buy into our tradition. You don't have to do that because that's not the truth of the gospel. That's good news. Thanks everybody for coming out today and listening. Hey, we can't make it without you. You guys have been really great lately helping support Revolution. I would love to do this full time again. I'm so grateful that I'm able to work with my landlord and paint apartments and fix up apartments and get them ready to go for new tenants. And that really helps me pay my rent. But I would really love to be able to do this more and more and spend more time like I was able to these past few days, just diving into books and reading about Galatians and reading other books about Galatians. And that's my promise to you, is that I'll always try to go as deep as I can and take it into new directions through philosophy, psychology, scholarship, finding commentaries that are like have good scholarship in them and that are made by really well educated people as well, to keep checking that out. And we'll continue to also speak truth to power and practice this grace and love. And so I don't mean to give people a hard time, but I give you a hard time, it's only because I want to see you become actually more inclusive. Like I want to see people who say they're inclusive be like even more radically inclusive and show radical grace and see how amazing that is, rather than just kind of this kind of weird type of business capitalist grace. Because if I associate with that person, what will happen to me? But yeah, we could use your support. So you can go to revolutionchurch.com and you can donate on our Venmo or our PayPal. PayPal is a little bit harder for me because I'm always trying to write. It's harder for me to get my thank yous to you guys because it's all through email, and the email has to connect to another email, and my emails are connected to another email. So I'm always having to make sure that those emails are all like going through 3 channels. But if you give on Venmo, I can just hit you with a message right away. Thank you so much. Hey, what's up? If you want some stickers and you Venmo or you PayPal, it probably work best on Venmo. But if you do that, just say, hey Jay, I'd love some of those stickers. Here's my address. I sent some out to somebody the other day. Anyway, love you guys. Thank you so much, and we'll dive into this even deeper next week. Same time, same channel, same Bat Bible. So thank you all. Lots of love, lots of grace. May peace be with you this week, everybody. I know it's a tough week. I don't often pray, but right now I'm going to just say, hey, Jesus, just give us strength, give us grace, give us peace that passes all understanding. Help us to love one another more. Encourage us to be human and to take care of ourselves and to be gentle with ourselves and to be gentle with others. Amen. Thanks. Bye-bye.